Advent's call to us is a call to watch and to wait and to get ready for the birth of hope and peace, to actually prepare for the gift of the ever newly coming of God. The gospel writer sets the stage, describes the context for the birth of Jesus, making sure that all who come after will realize that the advent of God's hope and justice, that the reality of God with us happens in real and complex political and religious situations with competing claims of power and authority. It's been the case throughout history. That was the truth for John's proclamation of the coming of Jesus. These proclamations that God is going to step in and make things right occur in real time, in the midst of religious turmoil and in the context of political power-mongering and imperialistic maneuvering. We read, "In the 15th year of the reign of Emperor Tiberius, when Pontius Pilate was governor of Judea, and Herod was ruler of Galilee." That puts it in the historic time, in a real setting. Now, Tiberius was quite the reluctant ruler. He kind of did everything he could to avoid becoming emperor. And then when he did become emperor, when he finally conceded, he actually opted out of really governing. Instead, he ceded his power to sinister underlings, those who really wanted to be in power. And Pontius Pilate, we know about him. We know about him from his behavior at Jesus' trial. Pontius Pilate was ambivalent too. And then there was Herod, the brutal tyrant who, perhaps for political advantage, now listen, converted himself to Judaism, but in contradiction of Jewish traditional values. Herod lived lavishly. He spent fortunes on building projects and ignored the needs of the people. The Jews resented him and hated him for perverting their religion in such a way. Obsessed with his image, Herod used secret police to monitor the feelings of the general populace toward him. What do they think about me? He prohibited public protests. He had any opponents to him forcibly removed if they tried to protest. Historians say that he had a personal bodyguard of 2,000 soldiers. In his self-serving way, he built fortresses into which he and his family could take refuge in case of insurrection. And he instituted a taxation system that heavily burdened the Judean people. Prophetic proclamation of the coming of God's messenger also occurs in religious context in addition to political context. Religious context with its arguments about who gets to participate in communities of God's people, who are insiders, and what sort of people are relegated to the margins, outsiders. We're told that it was during the high priesthood of Annas and Caiaphas that John the Baptist raised his voice. The priest Annas was appointed as the very first high priest of the newly formed Roman province of Judea. You may also remember that he was the high priest before whom Jesus is brought for judgment before he goes to Pontius Pilate. And Caiaphas, who's the son-in-law of Annas, was the one who organized later a plot to kill Jesus. Both were considered to be puppet priests, putting the priesthood under political domination. So co-opting religion for political purposes. You may also, And Caiaphas, the son-in-law of Annas, as I said, was the one who organized the plot to kill Jesus. Religious authority then was a sham, a sellout to Herod's tyrannical government. It's into this context that prophets speak, challenging authority, announcing God's justice and judgment in the face of inequity. In between the lines of authoritative misdeeds of politicians and priests as well, we hear the prophet's promises of God with us. And we hear the urgent call to prepare, to ready ourselves for the inbreaking of God's righteousness and justice. Our texts for today, for this second Sunday of Advent, offer some tough images of how we prepare to receive God's presence, how God readies us to recognize and even reimagine how love might come to us in our time. We hear images of repentance and of the purifying power of fire and soap. Both the Hebrew and the Christian prophets bear witness to this need to prepare. John calls people to repentance. That is, to turn around, to change their hearts so that they can recognize God's coming into the world. Centuries before John, the prophet Malachi issues a sharp admonition about preparatory action for God's presence. He says this, "I am sending my messenger to prepare the way before me. But who can endure the day of his coming, and who can stand when the Holy One appears? This one is like a refiner's fire and like fuller's soap, and will purify and refine like gold and silver." The implication then is that human beings, need to be reshaped, to have our character scrubbed so that this prophetic spirit can be born in us, so that we can endure the coming of justice and peace. The prophet's call, however, doesn't come as threat or punishment, but as an invitation to be all that we are created to be. I heard a story a long time ago about a judge who, this is actually a true story, a judge who sentenced a man to go to church for the rest of his life. Now, was this supposed to redeem him or transform him? Perhaps it would if he went willingly, but more likely it'd make him resentful of religion, I would think. But this imposition of righteousness, this imposition of holiness, isn't what the prophet is suggesting. Rather, Malachi's summons is a plea for us to ready ourselves to host the love and justice of God that longs to be in us and with us. John the Baptist announces righteousness and justice as signs of Christ's coming. He quotes from the prophet Isaiah sort of as his calling card. In fact, if we hear these words, we probably think of John before we think of Isaiah. The voice of one crying out in the wilderness, "Prepare the way of the Lord. Make the path straight. Every valley shall be filled, every mountain and hill be made low. The crooked made straight and the rough ways made smooth, and all flesh shall see the salvation of God." John then defines God's coming as putting things right, spiritually and socially, creating justice. The need for this change is obvious. If people are to survive spiritually, things had to change then and have to change now. The situation was similar for the prophet Malachi, who speaks to a people who are just returned from exile. After the exile, they have rebuilt the temple, but it turns out that temple is just an outward symbol. Inwardly, the people are spiritually numb. They're cynical and self-focused, impervious to the Spirit's power to renew them, to reestablish them as God's people. Even the priests slacked on their religious life. They had decided that they could do just fine without this irrelevant notion of God. And so the prophet simply calls for someone to shut the temple doors. No religion, he seemed to say, no religion at all is better than a sham. But Malachi joins with God in believing that this community of God's people can be renewed, that they can be holy and good, that they can think of others and give generously. But this renewal, he says, this transformation will take drastic change. If their lives were to sparkle like polished silver, the transformation, the process, would have to be like a refiner's fire. If their hearts were to be cleansed so that they could host compassion and hope, they would need to be scrubbed up with strong spiritual soap. And so, bravely, Malachi announces to those who don't much care that God is coming and that God has clear intentions to refine and cleanse them, to prepare them for abundant life, and to equip them to bless others around them. And so he takes these images. God is like a refiner's fire. Now, as we know, refineries require intense heat to burn out impurities and yield pure metal. A white-hot blaze melts the ore and brings the impurities to the surface where they can be skimmed away. Deep and hot, God burns away all that keeps us from purity, so that the inner beauty, the God spark inside of us, can shine. God burns deeply, all the way to anything that holds us back, all the way to our fears, all the way to our self-destructive tendencies, to our feelings of impotence, or to our arrogance. God's fire distills us into people of substance, solid and pure. The first experience I can remember of fire, of actually experiencing fire as a child, was burning up the raked leaves every autumn. I remember the fire's heat close at hand, that you couldn't get too close to that fire, realizing the power and danger that it held. God is like that, Malachi says. A blazing fire, hot and close. And so to be in God's presence is always a bit dangerous because it changes everything. The fire of God comes in many forms. Jesus experienced it, I think, in the wilderness. I've experienced it in wildernesses as well. Perhaps you have too. What just happened to us, or what others meant for harm for us, God can somehow, with fire, transform into strength for us. When life's pits of hell shape us and purify us to make us stronger, we are experiencing the fire of God. When we go with another through trouble or betrayal or fear and somehow emerge on the other side, that fire of God that doesn't consume us strengthens us with purpose and power. God is like a refiner's fire, and God is fuller's soap. Like fire, of course, soap cleanses and purifies, but the image elicits something quite different. We keep our distance from fire. It can be terrifying. Soap, on the other hand, is our friend. We rub it all over ourselves, trusting us to leave us presentable and smelling good. I'm almost embarrassed to tell you that when I left my parents' home at age 21, I hadn't the slightest idea how to do my own laundry. It's embarrassing, but it's true. My mother insisted. She insisted on washing our clothes, hanging them outside on the clothesline to dry, and then ironing every piece. And even though it probably would have been healthier for me to learn to do it myself, I did experience her efforts as a true labor of love that left us cleaned up and presentable for life. I read a story about a Lutheran minister who worked in Zimbabwe. He tells this story of male elders who worked in a dormitory for seminarians. These male service workers wash the undergarments of the male students, but not of the women. Perhaps they consider it inappropriate, even taboo, but it was too close. It was too intimate. But, he explains, Zimbabwean mothers don't have such choices. That which others will not touch, the garments soiled by intimate bodily processes, garments of men and women and children, mothers will wash and hang out to dry. It's an act of love, an act of intimacy that describes God's cleansing of us. The image suggests that God gets close enough to touch and smell that which keeps us from being spiritually clean. That God steps in and washes us so that we can be scrubbed and sparkle with life. Now, Fuller's soap is a strong lye-based soap that bleaches out stains. So the image is taken further. The cleansing Spirit washes us hard and deep, giving us new or renewed perspectives, giving to us compassion and hope. God's soap is found in prayer and meditation, in therapy, perhaps, or in ritual. If we'll consider praying, either again or maybe for the first time for some of us, maybe we can prepare for God in us. If we start with simply listening, it will at least calm us down, if nothing else, and that's no small thing. If we're calmer, if our spirits are even slightly open, we may be able to experience this deep, cleansing soap of God. This soap of God can work also through the service that we offer to others. In helping others, our motives are sacralized, made holy, and we begin to perceive ourselves as good, maybe even clean, ready to receive and to give God with us. And so with fire and soap, with power and efficacy, with tenderness and intimacy, God prepares us so that God can be born in us again and again. If we're going to be ready to receive the God of love and justice, we need that fire and soap. Not to punish us for our impurities or to mold us into some holier-than-thou religious prudes, but to make us genuinely good and genuinely life-filled people. If we are to bring life and hope, compassion and peace, if our lives are to embody Christ and bless others, God will work in us to refine us and cleanse us and prepare us. And so during these days, not unlike that time of Malachi, we too confront politicians and priests who threaten God's ways of justice, who beat down hope, who pervert the messages of religion for personal gain, who keep people oppressed. During these days, may our Advent prayer be that God will refine us by fire, will cleanse us with fuller's soap so that we'll be ready to receive Christ anew, and so that we can be the living expression of God's love and justice and peace. Amen.